Society had a rule for women like Josephine Farrow: be silent, be useful, and above all, be invisible. She had followed that rule for 6 years without complaint. Then a prize stallion collapsed in front of 40 horrified guests, and while grooms and a frightened veterinarian stood paralyzed, Josephine walked straight into the chaos and put her bare hands on a dying animal everyone else was too afraid to touch. She had no idea the man watching her, ashen face of the rail, was the Duke of Rothwell himself. Josephine Farrow was 24 years old and had spent the better part of 6 years perfecting the particular art of taking up as little space as possible. She lived, at the sufferance of her aunt, Lady Constance Aldridge, in a handsome house in Wiltshire that had never once felt like home, earning her keep by mending linens, managing correspondence nobody else wished to write, and trailing 3 respectful paces behind her cousin Lavinia at every social occasion her aunt deemed worth attending. She had not always been invisible. Her father, Thomas Farrow, had been a country veterinary surgeon of unusual skill, the kind of man great houses quietly summoned when their prize hunters or racing stock fell gravely ill and their own stable masters had exhausted every remedy they knew. Josephine had grown up in stables rather than drawing rooms, learning to read a horse's temperament in the set of its ears and the sweat along its flank long, before she learned to read a novel. When a fever took her father 6 years earlier, along with a modest practice that had been their only income, Josephine had been delivered to her aunt's household the way an unwanted parcel is delivered to a relation who cannot quite bring herself to refuse it outright. "You will not speak of horses at dinner, Josephine." Lady Constance had informed her within the first week of her arrival, in the brisk, final tone she used for every instruction regarding her niece's conduct. "It is not a fit subject for a young lady, and I will not have Lavinia's prospects diminished by association with such coarse enthusiasms." Josephine had learned to obey. She had learned to fold her hands, lower her eyes, and let the world assume there was nothing of substance behind her quiet compliance. It was, she had discovered, its own strange kind of safety. Nobody expected anything of a woman they had already decided was unremarkable, and nobody troubled themselves to notice when she slipped away to the stables in the grey hour before the household woke, simply to stand near horses again and remember who she had been before her father died. There had been a particular winter, 3 years into her residence with Lady Constance, when the loneliness of that careful invisibility had nearly broken her entirely. A fever had swept through the household, and Josephine, too useful a pair of hands to be permitted her own convalescence, had nursed both her aunt and cousin through a full fortnight of illness while suppressing her own rising temperature, too frightened of becoming a burden to admit she was unwell herself, until she had finally collapsed in the upstairs corridor and been discovered only by chance. She had recovered, eventually, in the same narrow guest chamber she had always occupied, with no one at her bedside beyond an elderly housemaid instructed to check on her twice daily between other duties. It was that particular winter, more than any single unkind word from her aunt, that had taught Josephine the precise shape and weight of her own invisibility, and the particular resilience required to survive it without bitterness curdling into something that might poison whatever kindness she still had left to offer the world. The house party at Amberley, the vast Hampshire estate belonging to Lord and Lady Harcourt, was to be the highlight of Lavinia's season, a full week of entertainments culminating in a celebrated exhibition of the Duke of Rothwell's famous racing stock, stallions so prized that half the sporting gentlemen in England had travelled considerable distances merely to watch them put through their paces on Amberley's private track. Josephine attended, as she attended everything, in her aunt's shadow, expected to admire and applaud and otherwise remain entirely unremarked upon. The Duke of Rothwell himself was a subject of considerable fascination among the assembled guests, though Josephine had gathered only fragments of his history from the fervent gossip exchanged over breakfast trays. He was 33, immensely wealthy, and had not attended a London season in nearly 4 years, ever since his younger brother had died in a riding accident on Rothwell land, an accident several of the more indiscreet guests whispered had occurred under circumstances the Duke himself had never fully explained, fueling a persistent, unkind rumor that he blamed himself for so completely he could no longer bear ordinary society at all. Josephine had seen him only once before the exhibition, from a considerable distance, and had formed the general impression of a tall, severe man who inspected his own horses with far more evident warmth than he extended to any of the guests attempting to engage him in conversation. She had not expected to see him again at close quarters at all, and certainly not under the circumstances that unfolded on the third afternoon of the house party. The exhibition track at Amberley ran along a wide green field below the terrace, and nearly the entire party had gathered at the railing to watch Rothwell's prize stallion, a magnificent bay named Meridian, put through a demonstration of speed that had already drawn admiring gasps from the assembled sporting gentlemen. Josephine stood near the back of the crowd, as always, close enough to watch but far enough to remain unnoticed, when Meridian's stride broke suddenly and violently, the great horse stumbling, then collapsing entirely in the middle of the track with a scream of pain that silenced every conversation on the terrace at once. Chaos erupted immediately. Grooms rushed forward, shouting conflicting instructions. The estate's own veterinary surgeon, a nervous young man named Mr. Peabody, who had clearly never before been asked to treat an animal of such value in front of an audience of this size, knelt beside the thrashing stallion with visibly shaking hands, entirely unable to determine what had gone wrong or how to proceed. Meridian's eyes had rolled white with panic, his powerful legs flailing dangerously close to anyone who ventured near, and the crowd on the terrace, initially horrified, had begun the particular murmuring specific to people who sense they are about to witness a valuable animal die in front of them. Josephine watched the scene unfold with a horror that felt disconcertingly familiar, a sharp echo of the final days of her father's own illness, when she had stood at the edge of a sick room feeling equally helpless against a suffering she understood far better than anyone else present, yet lacked the authority to act upon. She remembered, with sudden vivid clarity, her father's voice from years earlier, calm even in crisis, explaining to her small, frightened self exactly how to read the signs of colic in a distressed animal, exactly what intervention might mean the difference between recovery and catastrophe. The memory settled something in her chest, a familiar, steadying resolve she had not felt in years of careful deference to other people's authority. Josephine did not remember consciously deciding to move. She simply found herself walking quickly down the terrace steps and out onto the grass, gathering her skirts with one hand, while behind her she heard her aunt's sharp, scandalized whisper her name go entirely unheeded. "Get back!" Mr. Peabody said as she approached, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "This is no place for a lady. He'll take your arm off." "He is colicking," Josephine said, crouching a careful distance from the stallion's flailing legs, her voice pitched low and steady in the particular register her father had taught her years before, a tone meant to travel to a frightened animal's ears without adding to its fear. "Look at his flank, how he keeps drawing his leg toward his belly. He is not lame. He is in pain from within." "I am aware of the symptoms," Peabody snapped, though his hands remained frozen, clearly uncertain what intervention to attempt with half of fashionable England watching his every move. "Then why have you not walked him?" Josephine asked, already moving closer to the stallion's head, ignoring the fresh gasps that rippled through the crowd behind her. "He must not be permitted to roll, or the gut may twist entirely, and then no remedy in England will save him. We need him on his feet and moving, now, before the pain drives him to thrash himself into worse injury." She did not wait for Peabody's agreement. She approached Meridian's head with slow, deliberate movements, murmuring the low, wordless sounds her father had used with panicked animals 100 times in her childhood memory, and reached out to grip the halter with both hands even as two grooms shouted warnings that she would be trampled for her trouble. The great stallion's wild eye fixed on her, and for one suspended moment Josephine understood she had made herself entirely vulnerable to 1,800 pounds of terrified animal, and then, astonishingly, Meridian's thrashing knees, his breath coming in great ragged heaves rather than frantic gasps, some instinct in him settling beneath the steady, unafraid pressure her hands. "Up," Josephine said firmly, applying gentle, insistent pressure to the halter. "Up now. That's it. Up." With considerable effort and the assistance of two grooms who had finally found their courage, Meridian lurched unsteadily onto his feet, still trembling, still clearly in significant pain, but upright and no longer at immediate risk of the fatal twist Josephine had feared. She kept her hand on his neck, walking him in slow, deliberate circles across the grass, murmuring continuously, while Mr. Peabody hurried to fetch the linseed oil and warm water that might, if administered quickly enough, ease whatever obstruction had caused the sudden violent attack. It was nearly 20 minutes before Meridian's condition stabilized enough for Josephine to finally step back, her hands trembling now that the crisis had passed, her fine muslin dress streaked with mud and sweat and wells, entirely aware for the first time since she had walked down those terrace steps of the profound silence that had fallen over the assembled crowd. She turned, and found herself facing a man who had clearly pushed through the entire gathered party to reach the rail closest to the track. Tall, dark-haired, his face ashen with fear that had only just begun to ease into something closer to stunned relief. His clothes were finer than any groom's, though he had clearly been standing among the sporting gentlemen rather than the fashionable ladies on the terrace proper, and something in the raw, unguarded intensity of his expression told Josephine, even before anyone spoke his name, that she had just handled the property of a man whose good opinion mattered a very great deal to everyone else present. "You saved him," the man said, his voice rough, carrying none of the polished detachment Josephine had come to expect from the great house's more distinguished guests. "I merely kept him upright and moving until proper treatment could be administered," Josephine said, suddenly, acutely conscious of a ruined dress and a disheveled hair, of every eye on the terrace now fixed upon her with an attention she had spent 6 careful years avoiding. "The credit belongs to Mr. Peabody's linseed remedy. She stopped, uncertain of his rank, though something in his bearing suggested it was considerable. "Rothwell," he said. "Julian Vance, Duke of Rothwell. And that stallion is worth more to me than every other creature currently standing on this field, myself included." He looked past her at Meridian, still trembling but breathing steadily now, and something in his hard, guarded expression cracked open into naked, unguarded gratitude. "Who taught you to do that?" "My father," Josephine said quietly. "He was a veterinary surgeon. I grew up in stables rather than ballrooms, Your Grace, which I understand makes me rather unsuitable company for an occasion such as this one." Something in the Duke's dark eyes sharpened with sudden, focused interest, and Josephine felt, for the first time in 6 long years of careful invisibility, the distinctly unsettling sensation of being genuinely, thoroughly seen. "You spoke to him as though he understood you," Rothwell said, glancing back at Meridian, still trembling but breathing steadily now under a groom's careful attention. "Most men who work with horses their whole lives never learn that particular trick. My own head groom manages fear with force, more often than not, when force is precisely the wrong tool for a frightened animal. Force rarely solves anything a creature is already too afraid to bear," Josephine said, before she could stop herself, the observation slipping out with more bluntness than 6 years of careful deference should have permitted. She flushed, suddenly aware of how far she had strayed from her usual practiced invisibility. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I do not typically offer opinions so freely." "Do not apologize," Rothwell said, something almost urgent entering his voice. I have spent the better part of an hour listening to 40 guests offer opinions on my stallion's collapse, and not one of them said anything half so useful as what you have told me in the span of 2 sentences. I find myself considerably more interested in further opinions, Miss Farrow, whenever you are inclined to share them. Lady Harcourt's voice, sharp with social alarm, cut across the moment before Josephine could respond, summoning both the Duke and the assembled guests back toward the terrace with a particular brittle cheer of a hostess desperate to salvage an afternoon gone badly awry. Rothwell did not immediately move to obey the summons, lingering a moment longer beside Josephine with an expression she did not yet have the experience to properly interpret, before finally offering a brief, formal bow and returning to his duties among the shaking guests. Lady Constance did not share the Duke's gratitude. She descended upon Josephine the moment the crowd began to disperse, her face rigid with a fury that had clearly been building throughout the entire spectacle. "You have made an absolute exhibition of yourself," she hissed, gripping Josephine's elbow with painful force as she steered her away from the field. Wading into danger in front of the Duke of Rothwell and half the county, covered in filth like a common stable hand. "Do you have any notion what this does to Lavinia's prospects, Josephine, to be associated with a cousin who behaves with such reckless disregard for propriety?" "A horse was dying, Aunt," Josephine said, though she had long since learned that such explanations rarely softened her aunt's displeasure. "I did what needed doing." "What needed doing was for you to remain exactly where companion belongs, silent, at the rail, admiring the spectacle rather than becoming one," Lady Constance snapped. "I begin to wonder whether keeping you in this household was ever a wise charity. Perhaps it is time you found employment more suited to your evident enthusiasms. A governess post, or better yet, a position in some rural veterinary establishment where your coarse habits might actually prove useful rather than embarrassing." Josephine said nothing further, retreating to her small guest chamber to change out of a ruined dress, though the threat settled into the familiar cold place in her chest where she had long stored every similar warning her aunt had delivered over 6 years of careful, grudging tolerance. She did not expect to hear from the Duke of Rothwell again beyond that single startled exchange beside the exhibition track, and was considerably surprised when, the following morning, a message arrived requesting her presence at the Amberley stables, where His Grace wished to consult her further regarding Meridian's continued recovery. She found him already there when she arrived, standing beside the Stallion's stall with the same intense, focused attention he had shown at the height of the crisis, dressed now in plain riding clothes rather than the fine coat he had worn among yesterday's guests. Meridian, though still favoring his left side slightly, had clearly improved considerably overnight, his eyes bright and alert rather than rolling white with pain. "He is much recovered," Josephine observed, approaching the store with the same easy familiarity she had shown the previous afternoon. "You have kept him from rich feed, I trust? A horse recovering from colic must be brought back to full rations gradually, or the risk returns." "Mr. Peabody has followed your instructions to the letter," Rothwell said, something wry entering his voice, though I confess he did so with rather less enthusiasm than I would have liked, given that a young lady with no formal training had just corrected his diagnosis in front of 40 witnesses. "I did not correct his diagnosis, Your Grace. I merely acted more quickly than his fear permitted him to." "A fine distinction, though I suspect Mr. Peabody does not share your generosity of interpretation." Rothwell studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes carrying the same searching intensity she had noticed the day before. "I find myself in an unusual position, Miss Farrow. I have 3 additional horses on this estate exhibiting symptoms my own veterinary staff cannot adequately explain. A persistent, low fever in 2 of my finest brood mares, and a curious lethargy in a 3rd stallion that has cost me considerable money in a cancelled stud arrangement. I do not believe these ailments are natural." Josephine's attention sharpened. "You suspect deliberate harm." "I suspect," Rothwell said carefully, "that someone within my own stable staff has reason to want my breeding program to fail, though I have not yet determined who or precisely why. I would consider it a great personal favor, Miss Farrow, if you would examine the affected animals yourself, and tell me honestly whether my suspicions have any merit, or whether grief and exhaustion have simply made me see conspiracy where only misfortune exists." Josephine spent the better part of that morning examining the 3 horses in question, working with a thoroughness that drew increasingly respectful glances from the Amberley stable staff, most of whom had witnessed a handling of Meridian the previous day, and had clearly adjusted their expectations of the quiet companion who usually trailed silently behind Lady Constance's household. The brood-mare's fevers, she determined after careful examination, followed a pattern too regular and too isolated to the same corner of the stable to be natural contagion. The lethargic stallion's feed, when she insisted on inspecting it directly, carried a faint but unmistakable bitterness that had no business in properly stored oats. "Someone has been dosing them," Josephine told Rothwell that afternoon, showing him the suspect feed sample she had carefully preserved in a cloth. "Not enough to kill outright, which would draw immediate suspicion, but enough to weaken performance, delay breeding, and generally undermine confidence in your stock. I would want to examine your own stables at Rothwell directly to be entirely certain, Your Grace, but I do not believe this is misfortune." Rothwell's jaw tightened, a muscle working visibly beneath his composed exterior. "My head groom at Rothwell, a man named Josiah Crane, has managed my stable for 11 years, since before my brother's death. I trusted him absolutely. I confess I do not wish to believe he is capable of this." "Trust and capability are rarely so neatly aligned as we would wish them to be, Your Grace," Josephine said quietly, thinking, though she did not say so aloud, of her own aunt's capacity for casual cruelty dressed up a concern for propriety. It was 3 days later, once the house party at Amberley concluded and Josephine had returned with her aunt's household to Wiltshire, that Rothwell's letter arrived, a formal, carefully worded request, addressed through Lady Constance as propriety demanded, asking whether Miss Farrow might be permitted to travel to Rothwell Park for a period of some weeks to assist in identifying the source of the estate's ongoing troubles, with generous compensation offered for her expertise in a respectable companion provided for the duration of her stay. Lady Constance's initial fury at the presumption of the request dissolved, with startling speed, into calculating enthusiasm once she understood the scale of compensation on offer, and within a fortnight Josephine found herself installed in a modest but comfortable guest chamber at Rothwell Park, under the nominal chaperonage of a kindly, half-deaf widow named Mrs. Pemberton, tasked with the singular purpose of discovering exactly what Josiah Crane had been doing to undermine his employer's prize breeding stock. She did not have to search long. Within her first week at Rothwell, working quietly through the stable feed stores and breeding records with the same careful attention she had once applied to her father's veterinary ledgers, Josephine witnessed an incident that confirmed every suspicion Rothwell had voiced at Amberley, and revealed a cruelty considerably more immediate than mere sabotage. She had risen early, as was her habit, to examine a young colt showing signs of the same suspicious lethargy that had afflicted Rothwell's Amberley stallion, and arrived at the stable yard to find Crane, a broad, red-faced man with small, calculating eyes, berating a stable boy of perhaps 12 with a viciousness that stopped Josephine cold in the yard's entrance. "You'll ride him lame if that's what it takes," Crane snarled, gesturing at a chestnut gelding favoring one leg badly enough that even a casual observer could see the animal had no business carrying a rider that morning. "Lord Ashby's man is waiting on that sale, and I'll not lose a commission because you're too soft to put a horse through a little discomfort." "Is properly lame, sir," the boy stammered, clearly terrified. "If I ride him hard, he'll break down entirely." Crane's hand shot out, cuffing the boy hard enough to send him stumbling against the stall door. "You'll ride him, or you'll find yourself without a position and without a reference, and we'll see how soft you feel begging in the road come winter." Josephine did not consciously decide to intervene any more than she had consciously decided to walk onto the exhibition track at Amberley. She simply found herself crossing the yard with brisk, purposeful strides, her voice carrying the same flat authority she had used to calm a panicking stallion in front of 40 witnesses. "That horse will not be ridden this morning, Mr. Crane," Josephine said. "He is lame in the near foreleg, quite obviously so, and riding him in that condition risks permanent damage to an animal his Grace has already invested considerable expense in breeding." Crane rounded on her, his small eyes narrowing with a particular contempt Josephine recognized instantly from a lifetime of being underestimated. "This is stable business, miss, not fit for a lady's interference. I don't know what fancy notion His Grace has taken about your usefulness here, but I'll manage my own men and my own horses without instruction from." "You will manage them considerably more carefully, starting this morning," Josephine interrupted, her voice not rising but hardening in a way that made Crane's protest falter mid-sentence. "Or I shall report both this lame horse and the mark you have just left on this boy's face directly to His Grace, along with several rather more serious questions I've been gathering all week regarding the feed stores in the Eastern Barn." Something shifted in Crane's expression at the mention of the feed stores, a flicker of calculation quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape Josephine's notice. He muttered something indistinct about tending to other duties and retreated toward the far end of the yard, leaving the trembling stable boy and the lame gelding in Josephine's care. "Are you hurt?" Josephine asked the boy gently, crouching to examine the reddening mark on his cheek. "No, miss," he said, though his voice still shook. "Thank you, miss. He'll have it in for me now, though, for you speaking up." "Then he shall have it in for me as well," Josephine said, "which I find I mind a great deal less than I once might have." She reported the incident to Rothwell that same afternoon, in the estate office where he had taken to reviewing her findings each day with an attentiveness that had, over the preceding week, become something Josephine found herself quietly anticipating. He listened to her account of the lame gelding and the struck boy with a stillness that Josephine had already learned to recognize as barely restrained fury. "Crane has worked this estate since before I inherited," Rothwell said finally, his voice tight. "My father trusted him. My brother trusted him. I confess I have spent a better part of 4 years too consumed by my own grief to properly oversee what happens in my own stable yard, which I suppose has made it considerably easier for a man like Crane to help himself to whatever he pleased, financial or otherwise." "You need not carry that as a personal failing, Your Grace," Josephine said carefully. "Grief does not make a man responsible for another man's cruelty." Something in Rothwell's expression shifted, guarded and raw at once. "My brother Edmund died on this land," he said, the words coming slowly, as though pried loose from somewhere he rarely permitted anyone to reach. "A hunting accident, they called it, though I have spent 4 years turning over every detail of that day, wondering whether I might have prevented it had I been paying closer attention rather than occupied with a state business I considered more pressing at the time. Edmund adored the stable. He would ride out at dawn most mornings, and I had grown so accustomed to it that I did not think twice when he failed to return promptly that particular day until it was already too late." He looked at Josephine directly, something almost pleading in his dark eyes despite his evident effort to maintain his usual composure. "I have wondered, more than once these past weeks, whether Crane's negligence, or worse, played some role in that day as well, though I have never possessed sufficient evidence to properly investigate it." "Then let us find that evidence," Josephine said quietly, "alongside everything else." They worked together in the weeks that followed with an intensity that gradually dissolved the careful formality that had initially governed their exchanges. Josephine catalogued every irregularity in the stable's feed purchases, cross-referencing invoices against actual delivered quantities with the same meticulous attention her father had once brought to his veterinary ledgers, while Rothwell quietly interviewed long-time tenants and staff who had never before been asked, by anyone in authority, what they had actually witnessed regarding Crane's management of the estate's finest animals. Their days settled into a rhythm neither of them had anticipated finding so quickly comfortable. Josephine rose before dawn most mornings, as had always been her habit, and found more often than not that Julian had already risen as well, the two of them sharing the quiet stable yard in the great early light before the rest of the household woke, working alongside each other with a wordless ease that gradually replaced their earlier careful formality. He began asking her opinion not merely on the horses but on broader matters of the estate's management, listening to her observations with a genuine attentiveness she had never once experienced from any member of her aunt's household, and Josephine found herself, for the first time since her father's death, gradually permitting herself to speak her full mind without first calculating how much space she was entitled to occupy in the conversation. Mrs. Pemberton, tasked nominally with chaperoning these lengthening hours together, proved either genuinely too hard of hearing to notice the growing warmth between her charge and the Duke, or tactfully willing to overlook it, dozing through long afternoons in a sunny corner of the estate office while Josephine and Julian bent over ledgers and feed samples with an increasing, unspoken awareness of each other that neither yet had the courage to name directly. The picture that slowly emerged was uglier than either of them had initially suspected. Crane had spent years selling off the estate's finest breeding stock privately, replacing them with inferior animals disguised through careful grooming and forged pedigree papers, pocketing the difference while Rothwell, consumed by grief and increasingly detached from the daily operations of his own stable, had simply trusted the man's decade of apparent loyalty without close scrutiny. The mysterious ailments afflicting Rothwell's remaining prize stock, Josephine eventually determined through careful testing of the suspect feed, were the direct result of Crane's clumsy attempts to weaken or discredit any animal whose sale he had not personally arranged, ensuring his own fraudulent substitutions went unquestioned by comparison. And Edmund? Rothwell asked one evening. The two of them bent over the stable's ledgers by candlelight long after the rest of the household had retired, close enough now in their shared purpose that Josephine had stopped noticing the impropriety of their unchaperoned hours together, absorbed as neither of them any longer felt inclined to be by society's watchful accounting. Josephine hesitated, then produced a final piece of evidence she had been reluctant to share until she was entirely certain of its meaning, a groom's old, half-forgotten account, recorded in a stable hand's private diary Josephine had found tucked behind a loose board in the tack room, describing how Crane had insisted, against the animal's obvious unsoundness, that Edmund's favorite hunt to be saddled for that final ride, overruling the groom's own concerns about the horses recently. Strained tendon in order to avoid the expense and inconvenience of substituting a mount from Crane's own dwindling, honestly maintained stock. Rothwell read the account in silence, his face going pale, then rigid with a fury Josephine had not yet seen from him in their weeks of careful, growing partnership. "He killed my brother," he said finally, his voice flat with barely contained rage, "to avoid the cost of a sound horse. We do not know that with absolute certainty," Josephine said gently, though she did not doubt it herself. "But we know enough, I think, to finally end whatever hold this man has had on your household." The confrontation came the following morning, in the stable yard where Crane had ruled unchallenged for over a decade. Rothwell summoned him before the assembled staff, the ledgers and the groom's diary laid out on an overturned crate for anyone to examine, and delivered the accusation with a cold, controlled precision that Josephine suspected had taken him considerable effort to maintain. "You have sold my finest stock for your own profit, substituted inferior animals with forged papers to conceal the theft, and deliberately weakened the horses you could not otherwise dispose of quietly," Rothwell said, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "And I have reason to believe, Crane, that your negligence, or worse, cost my brother his life 4 years ago, when you saddled him on a horse you knew to be unsound rather than spend the money to replace it." Crane's ruddy face drained of color, his earlier bluster collapsing entirely under the weight of the evidence spread before him. "That was an accident," he said, though his voice had lost all its formal authority. "The horse stumbled. It could have happened to any rider, on any mount." "Julian," he corrected softly. I find I have grown rather tired of the distance that title creates, particularly with you. Julian, Josephine said, testing the name, finding it settle more easily on her tongue than she expected. I did not come here seeking anything beyond honest work and honest wages. I would not wish you to mistake gratitude, however genuine, for anything more permanent than the circumstances currently warrant. It is not merely gratitude, Julian said, reaching out to gently catch a strand of hair that had escaped her careful pins, tucking it back with a tenderness that made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts at composure. I have watched you face down a dying stallion, a cruel overseer, and the ugliest truth of my family's recent history, all without once losing the steady, clear-eyed courage that first drew my attention at Amberley. I do not offer you gratitude, Josephine. I offer you the whole of my considerable, admittedly rusty attention, should you be willing to accept it. Josephine's careful composure finally broke entirely, a sound that was half laugh, half something closer to disbelief escaping her before she could stop it. You are Duke Julian. I am a poor relation with ink-stained fingers and no dowry to speak of, sent here for my usefulness rather than my accomplishments. Whatever attention you offer me now will look considerably different once word of it reaches London. Let it reach London, Julian said, something fierce entering his voice. I have spent 4 years permitting London's expectation to dictate the shape of my grief, my solitude, and my sense of what I owed my family's memory. I find I have very little patience left for permitting it to dictate this as well. Word did reach London, and considerably faster than either of them anticipated. Lady Constance arrived at Rothwell Park unannounced barely a week later, summoned by an anxious letter from the ever-diligent Mrs. Pemberton describing, in careful but unmistakable terms, exactly how much time her niece had taken to spending in the Duke's private company. Lady Constance swept into the estate's drawing-room with the particular fury of a woman who had scented an opportunity slipping through her fingers before she had properly secured it for her own daughter's benefit. You will return to Wiltshire with me immediately, Lady Constance informed Josephine, barely waiting for the door to close behind them. Whatever foolish notions you have permitted yourself regarding His Grace's attention, I assure you they will end in nothing but your own ruin. Dukes do not marry penniless companions, Josephine, whatever momentary fascination your usefulness with his horses may have inspired. You will embarrass his family and destroy whatever remains of your own prospects if you continue in this fashion. I have no prospects to destroy, Aunt, Josephine said, with a calm steadiness that surprised even herself. You made that abundantly clear to me the day I arrived in your household 6 years ago, and you have reminded me of it regularly ever since. Lady Constance's face flushed with indignation, though before she could summon a suitable retort, the drawing-room door opened to admit Julian himself, who had clearly been informed of Lady Constance's arrival, and had come directly rather than permitting the confrontation to unfold without him. Lady Constance, Julian said, his voice carrying the same cold, absolute authority Josephine had watched him deploy against Crane in the stable yard. I understand you have come to remove Miss Farrow from my household. I have come to prevent a scandal, Your Grace, Lady Constance said, though her earlier fury had modulated considerably in the Duke's presence. My niece has clearly overstepped the bounds of her position here, and I would not wish to see either your reputation or Hayes suffer for it. My reputation, Julian said, will suffer considerably more if I permit you to remove from this house the woman who uncovered a decade of fraud, restored my family's finest breeding stock, and provided me the truth regarding my brother's death that 4 years of my own grief-addled efforts failed entirely to produce. I do not consider Miss Farrow's presence here an embarrassment, Lady Constance. I consider it the single most valuable thing that has happened to this estate in longer than I care to calculate. Lady Constance's mouth opened, then closed, clearly uncertain how to argue against the Duke's direct praise of a niece she had spent 6 years dismissing as an embarrassing burden. Your Grace is very generous, she managed finally, but generosity is not the same as— I am not merely being generous, Julian interrupted, crossing the room to stand beside Josephine with a deliberate, public closeness that left no ambiguity regarding his intentions. "I am informing you, Lady Constance, that I intend to marry your niece, with or without your blessing, though I would of course prefer to have it, for her sake if not for mine." Lady Constance stared at him, then at Josephine, her calculating expression cycling rapidly through shock, disbelief, and finally adorning avaricious understanding of exactly what this alliance might mean for her own family's standing, should she prove wise enough to embrace rather than obstruct it. "Well," she said finally, recovering some of her usual brisk composure. "Well, I confess I had not anticipated quite so serious an attachment, Your Grace, but I certainly would not wish to stand in the way of my niece's happiness, if that is indeed the genuine shape of your intentions." Josephine, still reeling from the public declaration, turned to look at Julian with an expression caught somewhere between astonishment and the beginning of something she had not permitted herself to feel in longer than she could remember. "You did not ask me," she said quietly, once Lady Constance had been ushered from the room by an attentive housemaid, ostensibly to rest from her journey, but more likely to begin composing letters to every acquaintance who might appreciate the news. "I am asking you now," Julian said, turning to face her fully, all trace of his earlier cold authority replaced by something far more vulnerable. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, though what he opened was not, Josephine realized with a startled laugh, a ring at all, but a delicate silver medallion engraved with the likeness of a horse's head, clearly commissioned rather than purchased ready-made. "I asked Meridian's own silversmith to craft this the week after Amberley," Julian admitted, something almost sheepish entering his composed voice for the first time since she had known him. "I did not yet know what I intended it for, only that I wanted some tangible reminder of the woman who had walked onto that track without a moment's hesitation for her own safety. I confess a ring felt insufficiently specific to what actually drew me to you." Josephine took the medallion, turning it over in her ink-stained fingers, and found herself laughing again, this time with an unguarded joy she had not permitted herself in 6 long years of careful invisibility. "It is entirely impractical as jewelry, Your Grace." "Julian," he corrected, though his mouth had curved into the rare, devastating smile she had come to treasure over their weeks of partnership. "And I did not say it was practical. I said it was true. Marry me, Josephine. Not because I am a duke and you require rescue from your aunt's household, though I will gladly provide that as well, but because I have not felt this steady, this genuinely myself, in the 4 years since Edmund died, until a woman with mud on her dress walked onto my exhibition track and reminded me that courage and tenderness are not, in fact, mutually exclusive qualities." "Yes," Josephine said, before he had even fully finished speaking, the single word carrying 6 years of careful restraint finally, joyfully abandoned. "Yes, Julian, 1,000 times yes." The wedding took place at Rothwell Park itself that autumn, in the estate's small stone chapel rather than any fashionable London church, filled not with the glittering society that had once dismissed Josephine as unremarkable, but with a stable staff, tenant families, and household servants who had watched her transform Rothwell's fortunes over the preceding months. The stable boy Josephine had defended in the yard, now formally apprenticed under a new, honest head groom Julian had personally selected, carried the rings on a small velvet cushion, his face flushed with the particular pride of a boy who understood he was witnessing something that had, in some meaningful way, begun with his own punishment months earlier. Lady Constance attended, considerably more gracious than her earlier visit had suggested she might be, and even Lavinia, whatever private jealousy she harbored over her cousin's unexpected elevation, offered Josephine a stiff but seemingly genuine embrace before the ceremony began. "Mr. Peabody," The young veterinary surgeon whose panic at Amberley had first given Josephine her opportunity, stood among the witnesses as well, having accepted Julian's offer of formal training under a more experienced surgeon, funded entirely by the Duke in gratitude for the role that terrifying afternoon had ultimately played in bringing his own household corruption to light. Josephine wore, at her own insistence, a simple gown of pale blue muslin rather than elaborate silk, unwilling to abandon entirely the plain practicality that had defined so much of her adult life, though Julian had quietly ensured the fabric itself was a considerably finer quality than anything she had ever previously owned. She carried, tucked into a small bouquet where only she and Julian would ever know it was there, the silver medallion he had first offered her in place of a ring, a private symbol of exactly how their unlikely partnership had truly begun. Julian, for his part, had spent the morning before the ceremony down at the stables rather than in any customary bridegroom's preparation, a fact Mrs. Pemberton discovered with some alarm when she went looking for him an hour before the appointed time, only to find him kneeling beside a mare in early labor, entirely unwilling to leave a birth in progress even for his own wedding. Josephine, informed of the delay, had simply laughed and gone down to the stable herself, still in her wedding finery, arriving in time to help deliver a healthy, wobbling filly into the world alongside her kneeling husband, both of them thoroughly disheveled and radiantly happy by the time they finally made their way to the waiting chapel, over an hour late and entirely unrepentant about it. The assembled guests, initially anxious at the delay, found themselves charmed rather than scandalized once the story circulated through the small gathering, and the tale of the Duke and his bride delivering a foal on their own wedding morning became, over the following years, one of the estate's most beloved and frequently retold stories, passed down among the stable staff with evident affection each time a new foal arrived to prompt the memory. The years that followed brought a transformation to Rothwell Park that extended well beyond the recovery of its breeding program, though that recovery proved considerable in its own right. Within 3 years, Rothwell's racing stock had regained, and then exceeded, the reputation Crane's years of quiet fraud had nearly destroyed, its stables once again drawing serious buyers and breeding contract from across the country. Josephine took formal charge of the estate's veterinary practices, training a growing staff of assistants in the careful, attentive methods her father had first taught her, and established, with Julian's full support, a modest fund to support stable workers injured or aged out of physical labor, ensuring no future groom would ever again face Crane's particular brand of casual cruelty without recourse. Julian, for his part, found in his marriage and his restored stable a path back to the parts of himself grief had walled away for 4 long years. He rode out at dawn most mornings now, much as his brother once had, though never without first checking every horse's soundness with the same careful thoroughness Josephine had taught him, a small daily ritual that had become, over time, less about vigilance against tragedy and more about genuine, uncomplicated joy in the animals and the land he had nearly lost himself in mourning rather than truly living within. The stable boy Josephine had once defended in the yard grew into young manhood under the estate's new, honest management, eventually training formally under Mr. Peabody's expanding veterinary practice, and Josephine took particular quiet satisfaction in watching him develop into precisely the kind of careful, attentive practitioner her own father had once been, a small living continuation of a legacy she had feared, in her darkest year with Lady Constance, might simply die with her in obscurity. The wider village around Rothwell Park, too, came to regard the estate with a warmth it had not known in years, tenant families no longer bracing themselves against Crane's casual cruelties, stable hands speaking openly to their employer without the fear that had once governed every interaction with the estate's management. Lady Constance, whatever her earlier calculating enthusiasm, became a regular if not entirely comfortable presence at Rothwell Park in the years that followed, her visits gradually softening from transparent social ambition into something closer to genuine, if still somewhat brisk, family affection, particularly once grandchildren began arriving to soften even her most rigid instincts toward propriety. Lavinia, for her part, eventually made her own respectable match 2 seasons later, and though the cousins never grew especially close, a wary, functional peace settled between them that Josephine found she was grateful enough to accept without expecting more. 5 years after that first terrible, transformative afternoon at Amberley, Josephine stood in the same stable yard where she had once faced down Josiah Crane, her young son perched on her hip, watching Julian lead a new foal, Meridian's own first offspring, born that spring, through its earliest, wobbling steps across the grass. The boy reached toward the foal with delighted, grasping hands, and Julian looked up to catch Josephine's eye across the yard, the same warm, unguarded affection in his expression that had first startled her all those years ago beside a dying stallion neither of them had expected would change the entire shape of their lives. Ink-stained fingers and no dowry to speak of, Julian called across the yard, an old, familiar tease between them by now, referencing the very words she had once used to warn him away from exactly this future. "Best bargain you ever made, Your Grace," Josephine called back, laughing, and watched her husband's face break into the rare, devastating smile she had spent 5 years treasuring, exactly as much now as she had the very first time she had seen it. Their son, growing bolder by the moment, finally wriggled free of Josephine's grip and toddled unsteadily across the grass toward his father and the new foal, and Julian scooped him up with one arm just before he could stumble too close to the still and steady animal, settling the boy against his hip with the easy, practiced tenderness of a man who had learned, over 5 years of marriage, exactly how to hold both the people and the creatures he loved with equal, careful strength. Josephine crossed the yard to join them, and for a long moment the four of them simply stood together in the golden afternoon light. The Duke, the veterinary surgeon's daughter he had married against every expectation of his rank, their son, and the newest foal of a bloodline that had very nearly been destroyed by one man's greed, a small, complete tableau of everything Rothwell Park had rebuilt itself into becoming since the terrible, transformative afternoon the dying stallion had first brought them together. "I used to think invisibility was the only safety I would ever have," Josephine said quietly, leaning into Julian's side as the foal took its first truly steady steps across the grass. "I am glad every single day that you refuse to let me remain that way. I am glad every single day that you refused to remain silent while the horse was dying," Julian replied, pressing a kiss to the top of their son's head, then to Josephine's temple. Some rescues, it turns out, go both directions at once. If Josephine and Julian's journey from a dying stallion to an unbreakable partnership moved you, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who believes true courage always finds the right person to notice it, and subscribe to the channel for more sweeping historical romances full of hidden strength, quiet dignity, and love stories worth every risk. Drop a comment below. Would you have walked onto that track to save a stranger's horse? Let me know, and I will see you in the next story.